Squirrels! Look like a booger. His hair. It's in a loop-de-loop. Don't make up nothing. And I'm going to leave the lights. Just leave them off. Save the power for the lives. All I do is replace those doggone batteries. Okay, back to chapter 2. Well, I'm going back just one sentence or so. Well, you've been at Sanssouci longer than I have. Can you honestly say you think any of these people who were there last night could be a dangerous enemy agent? Tuppence said thoughtfully, it does seem a little incredible. There's the young man, of course. Karl von Dienem? The police check up on refugees, don't they? I suppose so. Still, it might be managed. He's an attractive young man, you know. Meaning the girls will tell him things? But what girls? No generals or admirals' daughters floating around here. Perhaps he walks out with the company commander and the ATS. Be quiet, Tommy. We ought to be taking this seriously. I am taking it seriously. It's just that I feel we're on a wild goose chase. Tuppence said seriously, it's too early to say that. After all, nothing's going to be obvious about this business. What about Mrs. Perrine? Yes, said Tommy thoughtfully. There's Mrs. Perrine, I admit. She does want explaining. Tuppence said in a businesslike tone, what about us? I mean, how are we going to cooperate? Tommy said thoughtfully, we mustn't be seen about too much together. No, it would be fatal to suggest we know each other better than we appear to do. What we want to decide is the attitude, I think. Yes, I think pursuit is the best angle. Pursuit? Exactly. I pursue you. You do your best to escape, but being a mere chivalrous male don't always succeed. I've had 2 husbands, and I'm on the lookout for a third. You act the part of the hunted widower. Every now and then I pin you down somewhere. Pin you in a cafe. Catch you walking on the front. Everyone snickers and thinks it very funny. Sounds feasible, agreed Tommy. Tuppence said, there's a kind of age-long humor about the chaste male. That ought to stand us in good stead. If we're seen together, all anyone will do is snicker and say, look at poor old Meadows. Tommy gripped her arm suddenly. Look, he said, look ahead of you. By the corner of one of the shelters, a young man stood talking to a girl. They were both very earnest, very wrapped up in what they were saying. Tuppence said softly, Karl van Dienem. Who's the girl, I wonder? She's remarkably good-looking, whoever she is. Tuppence nodded. Her eyes dwelt thoughtfully on the dark, passionate face, and on the tight-fitting pullover that revealed the lines of the girl's figure. She was talking earnestly with emphasis. Karl von Dienem was listening to her. Tuppence murmured, I think this is where you leave me. Right, agreed Tommy. He turned and strolled in the opposite direction. At the end of the promenade, he encountered Major Bletchley. Name makes me giggle. Sounds like you're gonna bleh. The latter peered at him suspiciously and then grunted out, Good morning. Good morning. See, you're like me, an early riser, remarked Bletchley. Tommy said, One gets in the habit of it out east. Of course, that's many years ago now, but I still wake early. Quite right, too, said Major Bletchley with approval. These young fellas nowadays make me sick. Hot baths, coming down to breakfast at 10 o'clock or later. No wonder the Germans have been putting it over on us. No stamina. Soft lot of young pups. Army's not what it was anyway. Coddle 'em, that's what they do nowadays. Tuck 'em in at night with hot water bottles. Ugh, makes me sick. Tommy shook his head in melancholy fashion, and Major Bletchley, thus encouraged, went on. Discipline, that's what we need. Discipline. How are we going to win the war without discipline? Do you know, sir, some of these fellas come on parade in slacks, so I've been told. Can't expect to win a war that way. Slacks. My God. Mr. Meadows hazarded the opinion that things were very different from what they had been. It's all this democracy, said Major Bletchley gloomily. You can overdo anything. In my opinion, they're overdoing the democracy business. Mixing up the officers and the men, feeding together in restaurants. Ugh. The men don't like it, Meadows. The troops know. The troops always know. Of course, said Mr. Meadows, I have no real knowledge of army matters myself. The major interrupted him, shooting a quick sideways glance. In the show in the last war? Oh, yes. Thought so. Saw you'd been drilled. Shoulders. What regiment? 5th Corfishires. Tommy remembered to produce Meadows' military record. Ah, yes, Salonika. Yes. I was at Mespot. Bletchley plunged into reminiscences, and Tommy listened politely. Bletchley ended up wrathfully. And will they make use of me now? No, they will not. Too old be damned. I could teach one or two of these young cubs something about war. Even if it's only what not to do, suggested Tommy with a smile. What's that? A sense of humor was clearly not Major Bletchley's strong suit. He peered suspiciously at his companion. Tommy hastened to change the conversation. You know anything about that Mrs. Blenkinsop, I think her name is? That's right, Blenkinsop. Not a bad-looking woman, bit long in the tooth. Talks too much. Nice woman, but foolish. No, I don't know her. She's only been at San Souci a couple of days, he added. Why do you ask? Tommy explained. Happened to meet her just now. Wondered if she was always out as early as this. Don't know. I'm sure women aren't usually given to walking before breakfast, thank God, he added. Amen, said Tommy. He went on. I'm not much good at making polite conversation before breakfast. Hope I wasn't rude to the woman, but I wanted my exercise. Major Bletchley displayed instant sympathy. I'm with you, Meadows. I'm with you. Women are all very well in their place, but not before breakfast, he chuckled a little. Better be careful, old man. She's a widow, you know. Is she? The major dug him cheerfully in the ribs. We know what widows are. She's buried 2 husbands, and if you ask me, she's on the lookout for number 3. Keep a very wary eye open, Meadows. A wary eye. That's my advice. And in high good humor, Major Bletchley wheeled about at the end of the parade and set the pace for a smart walk back to breakfast at San Souci. In the meantime, Tuppence had gently continued her walk along the esplanade, passing quite close to the shelter and the young couple talking there. As she passed, she caught a few words. It was the girl speaking. But you must be careful, Carl. The very least suspicion. Tuppence was out of earshot. Suggestive words? Yes, but capable of any number of harmless interpretations. Unobtrusively she turned and again passed the 2. Again words floated to her. Smug, detestable English. The eyebrows of Mrs. Blenkinsop rose ever so slightly. Karl von Dienem was a refugee from Nazi persecution, given asylum and shelter by England. Neither wise nor grateful to listen assentingly to such words. Again Tuppence turned, but this time before she reached the shelter the couple had parted abruptly, the girl to cross the road leaving the seafront, Karl van Dienem to come along to Tuppence's direction. He would not perhaps have recognized her but for her own pause and hesitation. Then quickly he brought his heels together and bowed. Tuppence twittered, not tittered this time, twittered at him. "Good morning, Mr. Von Denham, isn't it? Such a lovely morning." "Yes, the weather's fine." Tuppence ran on. "It quite tempted me. I don't often come out before breakfast, but this morning, what with not sleeping very well, one doesn't sleep well in a strange place, I find. It takes a day or two to accustom oneself, I always say." "Oh, yes, no doubt that is so. And really this little walk has quite given me an appetite for breakfast. You will go back to Sans Souci now? If you permit, I will walk with you." He walked gravely by her side. Tuppence said, "You also are out to get an appetite?" Gravely he shook his head. "Oh no, my breakfast, I've already had it. I'm on the way to work." "Work?" "I'm a research chemist." "So that's what you are," thought Tuppence, stealing a quick glance at him. Carl Van Denham went on, his voice stiff. "I came to this country to escape Nazi persecution. I had very little money, no friends. I do now what useful work I can." He stared straight ahead of him. Tuppence was conscious of some undercurrent of strong feeling moving him powerfully. She murmured vaguely, "Oh, yes, I see. Very credible, I'm sure." Carl Van Denham said, "My two brothers are in concentration camps. My father died in one. My mother died of sorrow and fear." Tuppence thought, the way he says that, as though he had learned it by heart. Again she stole a quick glance at him. He was still staring ahead of him, his face impassive. They walked in silence for some moments. Two men passed them. One of them shot a quick glance at Carl. She heard him mutter to his companion, "Bet you that fellow is a German." Tuppence saw the color rise in Carl Von Denham's cheeks. Suddenly he lost command of himself. That tide of hidden emotion came to the surface. He stammered, You heard, that's what they say. My dear boy." Tuppence reverted suddenly to her real self. Her voice was crisp and compelling. "Don't be an idiot. You can't have it both ways." He turned his head and stared at her. "What do you mean?" "You're a refugee. You have to take the rough with the smooth. You're alive. That's the main thing. Alive and free. For the other, realize that it's inevitable. The country's at war. You're a German." She smiled suddenly. "You can't expect the mere man in the street, literally the man in the street, to distinguish between bad Germans and good Germans, if I may put it so crudely." He still stared at her, his eyes so very blue or poignant with suppressed feeling. Then suddenly he too smiled, and he said, "They said of red Indians, did they not, that a good Indian was a dead Indian?" He laughed. "To be a good German, I must be on time at my work, please. Good morning." Again that stiff bow. Tuppence stared after his retreating figure. She said to herself, "Mrs. Blenkinsop, you had a lapse then. Strict attention to business in future. Now for breakfast at Sans Souci's." The hall door of Sans Souci's was open. Inside, Mrs. Dang it. Okay. Sorry, put my finger down somewhere and the pages went flying. Hall door Sans Souci's was open. Inside, Mrs. Perrina was conducting a vigorous conversation with someone. "And you'll tell him what I think of that last lot of margarine? Get the cooked ham at Quiller's. It was 2 pence cheaper last time there. And be careful about the cabbages." She broke off as as Tuppence entered. "Oh, good morning, Mrs. Blenkinsop. You are an early bird. You haven't had breakfast yet. It's already in the dining room," she added, indicating her companion. "My daughter Sheila, you haven't met her. She's been away and only came home last night." Tuppence looked with interest at the vivid, handsome face, no longer full of tragic energy, bored now and resentful. "My daughter Sheila Perrina." Tuppence murmured a few pleasant words and went into the dining room. There were 3 people breakfasting: Mrs. Sprott and her baby girl, and big Mrs. O'Rourke. Tuppence said good morning, and Mrs. O'Rourke replied with a hearty "The top of the morning to you," that quite drowned Mrs. Sprott's more anemic salutation. The old woman stared at Tuppence with a kind of devouring interest. "'Tis a fine thing to be out walking before breakfast," she observed. "A grand appetite it gives you," Mrs. Sprott said to her offspring. "Nice bread and milk, darling," and endeavored to insinuate a spoonful into Miss Betty Sprott's mouth. The latter cleverly circumvented this endeavor by an adroit movement of her head, and continued to stare at Tuppence with large round eyes. She pointed a milky finger at the newcomer, gave her a dazzling smile, and observed in gurgling tones, "Gagaboosh." "She likes you," cried Mrs. Sprott, beaming on Tuppence as one marked out for favor. "Sometimes she's so shy with strangers." "Booch?" said Betty Sprott. "Ah, pootha a bag," she said. "Ah, poo a bag," she added with emphasis. "And what would she be meaning by that?" demanded Mrs. O'Rourke with interest. "She doesn't speak awfully clearly yet," confessed Mrs. Sprott. "She's only just over 2, you know. I'm afraid most of what she says is just bosh. She can say mama, though, can't you, darling?" Betty looked thoughtfully at her mother and remarked with an air of finality, "Cugglebeck." "Cugglebeck. 'Tis a language of their own they have, the little angels," boomed out Mrs. O'Rourke. "Betty, darling, say mama now." Betty looked hard at Mrs. O'Rourke, frowned, and observed with casual emphasis, "Naser, there now, if she isn't doing her best, and a lovely sweet girl she is, Naser." Mrs. O'Rourke rose, beamed in a ferocious manner at Betty, and waddled heavily out of the room. "Ga, ga, ga," said Betty, with enormous satisfaction, and beat with the spoon on the table. Tuppence said with a twinkle, "What does Naser really mean?" Mrs. Sprott said with a flush, "I'm afraid you know it's what Betty says when she doesn't like anyone or anything." Both women laughed. "After all," said Mrs. Sprott, "Mrs. O'Rourke means to be kind, but she is rather alarming with that deep voice and the beard and everything." And I'm going to stop right there, guys. I can't even see how long I read. My eyes are getting crazy. Get crazy, guys. Y'all have a good night. I was going to tell y'all something. Something came to my mind a while ago. Something that I read reminded me of it. And I was going to tell you, but it's gone. I'm sorry, it's gone. It's not have been very important. Love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Hope to see you live at 5 tomorrow. Bye-bye.